Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Gospel of Mark, A Beginner's Guide to the Good News by Amy-Jill Levine, narrated by Nan Mcnamara. Introduction. The Gospel of Mark, considered by most scholars to be the earliest canonical gospel, is shorter than the Gospels of Matthew, Luke, and John. Unlike the other three Gospels, Mark's text offers no account of Jesus' origins and no resurrection appearances. Instead, Mark's Gospel starts with the preaching of John the Baptizer, and it ends, at least in its earliest manuscripts, with three women fleeing the empty tomb in fear. Most biblical scholars agree that the evangelists we call Matthew, Luke, and John not only used Mark's Gospel as a source, but also supplemented and even sought to correct it. When the Gospel of Luke, chapter 1, verse 1, speaks of the many who have attempted to compile an orderly account of the story of Jesus, the writer most likely had Mark in mind. This study seeks to learn from and about the Gospel of Mark on its own terms, without the details the other three Gospels introduce. Going chapter by chapter rather than by themes, discipleship, Christology, miracles, etc., allows us better to experience Jesus' complex identity. At one point, unable to do mighty works because of people's unbelief, and at another, walking on the water as only God can do. At one point, demanding that people not announce his miracles, and at another, clearly announcing his death and resurrection. This progressive approach helps listeners to answer the question Jesus asks his disciples midway through, "Who do you say that I am?" Literal, "Who do you say me to be?" Mark chapter 8, verse 29. The answer may change at the end of each chapter. When we reread Mark's Gospel, the answer may change again, just as our sense of our loved ones changes over time. Since we cannot cover every story, this volume features in-depth studies of select passages that I have not elsewhere discussed in this series. I have provided my own fairly literal translations from the Greek and Hebrew in order to allow hearing the stories anew. They may seem choppy, and they are, but what they do is reveal where in the Greek sentences terms appear, stick more closely to the Greek than English translations that smooth over Mark's occasionally awkward syntax, and remind us all that we are reading a work that was written 2,000 years ago. You are encouraged to read along with your own Bible. Comparing my literal translation to your English versions will help you focus on hearing the text as if for the first time, and that's not a bad thing. The chapters locate these passages in their historical context, develop their connections to the Old Testament, the Christian Bible, Part 1, and explain how they impact both the events that follow and give added perspective into what is earlier described. This study reveals how the Gospel of Mark spoke to its earliest audiences and how it continues to speak to readers, including me, today. Initial questions, elusive answers. Who wrote this Gospel? We don't know. All four canonical Gospels were originally anonymous. Early Christian tradition regards Mark as the John Mark who accompanied Peter, until he didn't. See Acts chapter 12, verse 12, and chapter 15, verses 37 through 39. Therefore, we'll call the author Mark. Were I Peter, I might be inclined to sue Mark for defamation, given his generally negative presentation. We'll keep watch for Peter, who emerges in this gospel as a failed disciple. Yet we know from the other Gospels, from Paul's letters, and from post-biblical tradition, that Peter, after denying Jesus, became one of the leaders of the communities gathered in Jesus' name. Already, we glimpse Mark's genius. Mark gives us the first half of a story, up to Peter weeping upon hearing the cock crow after he 3 times denies Jesus. It is our responsibility to continue the story, to move from despair into hope, and from death into new life. Similarly, Mark leaves us at the empty tomb. It is our task to bring resurrection to the story of Jesus and find new life for ourselves as we read and reread. When was Mark's Gospel written? The text dates to the 1st century, probably after the Romans torched the Jerusalem temple in 70 CE. Where? Tradition locates Mark's Gospel in Rome. The first epistle of Peter, I doubt Peter the Apostle wrote this text, but that's another story, states, "She in Babylon, elect together with you, sends you greetings, and so does my son Mark." 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 13. Most English translations gloss that unidentified she with something like sister church. That she could be a woman. Again, another story for another time. Another tradition sees the Gospel as originating in Egypt, since Mark was considered the first bishop appointed there. Other suggestions include Upper Galilee and Syria. You can determine for yourselves whether the location would matter. For example, were Mark writing in the wake of Nero's scapegoating of Christians for the Great Fire in 64 in Rome, the Gospel's first readers may have understood Jesus' own suffering as mirroring theirs. But Mark's import was not and is not restricted to whatever an initial audience may have heard. Mark, like the other Gospel writers, likely addressed anyone willing to listen. Even why Mark wrote remains speculative, and Mark may have had multiple motives: to preserve the memories of Jesus as the first generation of followers died, to focus on Jesus' suffering rather than his miracles, to show that outsiders, a Syro-Phoenician woman, an unnamed woman who anoints Jesus, a centurion guarding the cross, can be more faithful than insiders such as the 12 disciples or the women who followed Jesus from Galilee to Jerusalem, to encourage perseverance despite despair, rejection, persecution, even death. When I first started studying the Bible, for an approximate date on that, when Noah was on the ark, my professors told me the Gospels of Matthew and John were written to Jewish followers of Jesus, and those of Mark and Luke were addressed to Gentiles. Today, biblical scholars are much more cautious. The arguments for positing a gospel community are circular. We read text, we construct the intended audience based on what we've read, and then we interpret the text based on the construction. Circular arguments are always problematic. Mark clearly has Gentile Jesus followers in mind, since Mark explains, sometimes incorrectly, Jewish customs. But I suspect Mark would be delighted were anyone, whether Jew or Samaritan or Gentile, to read this gospel. Upshot, Mark's gospel was written, in Greek, somewhere around or after the year 70 in the Roman Empire. That Mark's is the earliest of the extant gospels, others may have been lost to history, does not mean that Mark's gospel is the most accurate with respect to recording what Jesus said or did. The other evangelists may have had access to other earlier or better sources. Further, all the evangelists have their own agendas. They are not simply recording what they heard. They are also writing to develop the faith of their readers and to promote particular understandings of who Jesus is and what it means to follow him. Had Jesus' followers not been interested in different perspectives, they could have combined all 4 Gospels into one continuous narrative, as did the 2nd century Syrian Christian Tatian in his Diatessaron, Greek, through 4, 1, as do most Christmas pageants, with Matthew's Magi and Luke's shepherds, Passion narratives, with the famous 7 last words of Jesus taken from all 4 Gospels, or resurrection stories, Matthew's Great Commission, Luke's appearance of Jesus to 2 disciples on the road to Emmaus, John's Mary Magdalene at the tomb, and Doubting Thomas. When I ask my students to tell me what parts of the Gospels they find most memorable or most interesting, few, if any, cite material from Mark. Popular is Matthew, chapters 5 through 7, the Sermon on the Mount. In Mark's Gospel, Jesus teaches more by actions than by words. Many cite Luke's compassionate Jesus, who says, "Blessed are you poor," chapter 6, verse 20, tells the parables of the Good Samaritan and prodigal son, and prays from the cross, "Father, forgive them," chapter 23, verse 34. I picture Luke's Jesus extending his arms, and welcoming people into his embrace. Mark's Jesus is more likely to glare in frustration. Grading papers often makes me feel the same way, whether at demons who promote their own kingdom or at disciples who miss his points repeatedly. Some cite Jesus' self-revelation in John's Gospel. I am the true vine, chapter 15, verse 1. I am the bread of life, chapter 6, verse 35. I am the way and the truth and the life, chapter 14, verse 6. And the famous John chapter 3, verse 16, for in this way God loved the world, that his Son, the only begotten Son, he gave. Mark's Jesus is less self-revelatory than secretive. He often tells those whom he has healed not to make this news public. Mark's Jesus does not say anything plainly until chapter 8, midway through the Gospel, when he announces his forthcoming death. Mark is an acquired taste. Savor it slowly, let it lead, and let it challenge. The beginning. The Gospel of Mark begins, beginning. All words matter, especially for texts that were designed to be read aloud and that had to be copied by hand. The Greek for beginning is arche, as in archaeology. The Septuagint, abbreviated LXX, for 70, given the legend of 70 translators who prepared the Greek text from the Hebrew original. The Greek translation of Israel's scriptures, what Jews eventually called the Tanakh and Christians the Old Testament, starts, in the beginning, en arche, Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. Mark's opening invokes Genesis. We'll hear such echoes of that text throughout the Gospel. The next two words in Mark chapter 1, verse 1 are tu euangeliou, of the good news, or of the Gospel. Tu is easy. It's the genitive, the possessive form of the direct article, the. Now we've got a problem. There's an old Italian saying, traduttore, traditore, literally, translator, traitor. Every translator chooses among options. The Greek term in the nominative form is euangelion. Eu is good, as in eulogy and euphemism. Angelion, whence angel, means news or message. An angel is, by job description, a messenger. Thus, Mark's third word is literally good news. Mark again echoes the Septuagint. Isaiah chapter 40, verse 9 offers a herald of good news, euangelizomenos, a participle, and the good news in this verse is, here is your God. The term reappears in Isaiah chapter 52, verse 7, which in the Greek reads, like the feet of one bringing good news, euangelizomenos, of a report of peace, like the one bringing good news, euangelizomenos, of good things, because I will make your salvation heard, saying to Zion, your God will reign. For ancient Israel, salvation did not mean an eternal, blessed afterlife. It meant salvation from this worldly dangers, slavery, illness, war, famine, or drought. Salvation was palpable. So too, for the Gospels, the message of salvation, the good news, must be more than a post-mortem fate. Salvation also occurs in the here and now. For Mark's contemporaries, evangelion was a secular term. It was good news, usually of the political sort. The good news of the emperor's birthday, for example, often came with tax relief or gifts to the poor. However, thanks in no small measure to Mark, the term very early became associated with the story of Jesus. The Greek term comes into Latin as evangelium, whence evangelical, and then into Old English as God, that is, good, plus spell, that is, spiel or story, news, whence gospel. Thus, Mark opens with either the beginning of the good news of or the beginning of the gospel of. Mark will use evangelion 6 more times, chapter 1, verse 14 and 15, chapter 8, verse 35, chapter 10, verse 29, chapter 13, verse 10, chapter 14, verse 9, and in the appendix, chapter 16, verse 15. With each use comes additional nuance. Mark again offers an invitation. What good news do we find with each story, and then how do we find good news as we leave the empty tomb and carry the story forward? The next words are Iesu Christou, of Jesus Christ. Again, a translation problem. Don't worry, we won't stop at every word. Jesus' name in Aramaic would have been something like Yeshua, from the same Hebrew root as the names Joshua and Hosea, or the term Hosanna, which people shout as Jesus enters Jerusalem, Mark chapter 11, verse 9. It means, save now, or save, please. Christ is a Greek word that translates the Hebrew Meshiach, which means anointed. Meshiach can also be translated Messiah. Do we read Jesus Christ, Jesus Anointed, Jesus Messiah? All are correct, but each has a different nuance. Christ, which is not a last name — I've had students think that Jesus is the son of Mary and Joseph Christ — has the connotation of Lord or Savior. Anointed suggests a commission for a particular task. Kings and priests were anointed. Meshiach, or Messiah, connotes, at least in the Hebrew, less a divine being who saves from sin and death, and more a human being who announces the inbreaking of the Messianic age, signaled by the general resurrection of the dead, followed by a final judgment, and then peace on earth. Thus, when we read Mark's Gospel, we shall need to determine what kind of Christ, what kind of Messiah Jesus is. Compared to contemporaneous literature, Mark's Gospel looks like a biography. The technical term is bios, or a life, as in the term biology. Suetonius wrote Lives of the 12 Caesars. Philo of Alexandria wrote Life of Moses. And Mark was, as far as extant sources go, the first to write a life of Jesus. In antiquity, people wrote lives less to record what happened and more to provide moral guidance. Some biographies depict what an honorable person says or does, so that the life serves as a model to be imitated. Some depict what a dishonorable person does, so that the life serves as the model to be avoided. For Mark, Jesus the Christ who suffers and dies is the model to follow, hard as that path may be. Mark does not paper over the difficulties of discipleship. Jesus speaks plainly when he teaches, "If any wishes after me to follow, let that one deny himself or herself, and take up his or her cross and follow me." Mark chapter 8, verse 34. I've included herself and her because Jesus' followers and Mark's readers have never been only men. To take up the cross is to be willing to risk death, indeed to die, for the cause. Mark is not suggesting that disciples court martyrdom. No one, not even Jesus, wants to be put to death. Rather, Mark shows how to face death with grief and anger, but also with trust and hope. The last two words of chapter 1, verse 1, huia theo, meaning Son of God, are also problematic, but not only because of translation. The first problem is that these words do not occur in all major ancient manuscripts, since it's easier to explain why scribes added these terms to reinforce Jesus' divine status than to explain why scribes would have omitted the words. Many scholars think that Mark did not begin by identifying Jesus as the Son of God. Rather, copyists thought Jesus needed something more at the outset than the title Anointed One or Messiah, which would not initially have held much meaning for Gentile, that is, pagan, readers. The second problem is whether to capitalize Son in the expression Son of God. Ancient Greek does not give us the convention of capitalizing proper names or titles, so the choice is ours. The capital S indicates a divine being. The lowercase s does not. The title Son of God is known from Greek and Roman texts. Hercules, Perseus, Theseus, as well as Alexander the Great, Augustus Caesar, and lots of other figures were technically sons of one god or another. The previous sentence also reveals the problem with capitalization. we do not typically capitalize God in referring to Zeus or Odin, but we do in referring to the God of the Bible. Hence, theology impacts grammar. For ancient Israel, Son of God was especially associated with the Davidic kingship. Psalm 2, verse 7, Septuagint, for example, a royal psalm, states, "The Lord said to me, My son you are, I today have begotten you." Psalm 89, another royal psalm, reads in the Greek translation, "He himself will call me, My Father you are my God, and the upholder of my salvation. And I, a firstborn, will appoint him, the highest of the kings of the earth." Psalm 89, verses 26 through 27, Septuagint, Psalm 88, verses 27 through 28. So far, we have a beginning, something new, but something that also concerns the book of Genesis. We have good news, but the content is vague. Good news for whom? Regarding what? Now or in the future, or both? Son of God may have something to do with Davidic kingship, as well as appeal to Gentile readers who know of heroes with divine paternity. As we work our way through the Gospel, we'll find more allusions to the scriptures of Israel, a developing sense of the good news in terms of exorcism and healings, provision of food, and a death whose meaning we readers must determine for ourselves. Where are we going? For the rest of this introduction, we'll discuss how Mark begins to tease out the contents of this good news. It cannot be only that Jesus dies as a ransom for many, Mark chapter 10, verse 45, since Jesus will not die until chapter 15. Indeed, Mark may have written a gospel to supplement Paul's letters, since Paul makes much of Jesus' death and resurrection, but in his letters says very little about his life. Mark's good news begins with the preaching of John the Baptizer, Jesus' own baptism and temptation, the calling of his first disciples, and several healing stories. For this introduction, we'll develop those first several verses about John. For chapter 1, as with all the chapters in this book, we must choose which among Mark's numerous stories to highlight. Chapter 1, which covers the rest of Mark chapters 1 through 4, first considers John the Baptizer. Here we address Mark's repurposing of ancient Israel's prophecies, the question of Jesus' sinlessness, and the role of repentance. We turn then to the call of Levi, the tax collector, and what it would have meant for Jesus and his contemporaries to associate with tax collectors. We'll talk about fasting, a ritual still practiced by Jews, Christians, and many others. And we'll develop this point in terms of how we often misunderstand the practices of different religious traditions. We'll conclude this chapter with a discussion of Jesus' parables, especially that of the sower in Mark chapter 4, to learn how stories that are confusing, even for the disciples, are stories that help us realize the dangers of being insiders. The privilege of being an insider can make us complacent, intolerant, even wrong. Chapter 2, on Mark chapters 5 through 7, takes us to Jesus' rejection in Nazareth, a story that both Matthew and Luke rewrite, likely because they were uncomfortable with the idea that Jesus was incapable of performing miracles. We next consider the mission of the disciples in the light of the death of John the Baptizer, an intercalated or sandwiched story in which one helps to interpret the other. As Mark alerts us, the line between miracle and martyrdom, discipleship and death, is very thin. This chapter ends with the story of Jesus' debate with Pharisees over hand-washing, ritual purity, and morality. Here we learn about the historical Pharisees, explore how ritual can bring meaning and order to life, and discuss how metaphors help us think in new ways about values and behavior. Chapter 3 brings us to the Gospel's turning point, Mark chapters 8 through 10, where the evangelist takes us from impenetrable parables and commands to keep news of miracles quiet to Jesus' stark announcement that he is going to suffer and die, and on the third day rise. will unpack Jesus' statement that some of his disciples will not taste death before they see the kingdom come in power. Then we climb the mountain, traditionally identified as Mount Tabor, to witness Jesus' metamorphosis. Luke uses the term transfiguration, but Mark really does use the term metamorphosis, where his divinity leaks through his humanity and where he appears with Moses and Elijah, chapter 9, verses 2 through 13. We then consider one of, to my mind, Mark's most profound lines. The father of a demon-possessed boy who begs Jesus, "Help my unbelief," chapter 9, verse 24. We end this chapter with the third Passion prediction, chapter 10, verses 32 through 34 and verse 45, better to understand Jesus as the suffering servant, the martyr, and the ransom for many. Chapter 4 begins with the Passion narrative with Jesus' entry into Jerusalem in Mark chapter 11. We encounter one of the stories that my students resist, the cursing of the fig tree. Following is our discussion of the parable of the wicked tenants from Mark chapter 12, which, like the story of the fig tree, I find disturbing. Accepting the allegory of the Lord of the vineyard as God, his murdered son as Jesus, and the tenants as the Jerusalem political establishment, we also discuss the parable as an invitation to recognize and then to repudiate violence. Chapter 5 concerns Mark chapter 13, the little apocalypse, where Jesus predicts the destruction of the temple and then details, in highly symbolic language, the end of the world as we know it. His description includes the coming in glory and power of the Son of Humanity, often translated Son of Man. The Greek is anthropos, whence anthropology, the title he uses as his self-designation. We'll learn how this chapter both encourages and challenges, both assures and keeps us readers from becoming complacent. Chapter 6, on Mark chapter 14 and 15, focuses on two figures who continue both to fascinate and to disturb me and perhaps you. First, we meet the enigmatic Judas Iscariot, fated to betray Jesus. Mark's picture of Judas forces questions of predestination and personal responsibility, of the inexplicability of evil, and of the limits of forgiveness. Second, we come to Mark's most enigmatic figure, the young man who flees, naked, from Gethsemane. The conclusion brings us to Mark chapter 16, its initial 8 verses that describe the women's visit to the tomb, their encounter with a young man, who may be the streaker of Mark chapter 14, or an angel, or both, and the women's flight in fear and silence. For some of the early followers of Jesus, Mark's initial ending, which I think is brilliant, was insufficient. The so-called longer ending of Mark is where we find the commendation of taking up serpents and drinking poison. Given the Gospel's downplaying of miracles in favor of the suffering of Jesus, Mark likely would have been appalled at these additions. I think Mark wanted people to read this Gospel, or if they could not read, which would be most people in antiquity, to hear the text again and again. Each time through, new mysteries and marvels, new revelations and reflections appear. The text is inexhaustible in meaning. Chapter 1. The Good News begins. Mark chapters 1 through 4. John and his baptism. Mark's Gospel was not simply read from a scroll page by page. More likely, the reader would explain the text passage by passage. Otherwise, the opening is like whiplash. First, we have the beginning of the Gospel of Jesus Messiah, with Son of God perhaps added. And immediately, we get a quote that is a mashup of verses from the prophets, a quote that is less about Jesus than it is about John the Baptizer. Mysteries abound. Who is this John? Why is he dunking people in the Jordan River? Why, if he promotes repentance, is Jesus coming to him? Did Jesus sin? Mark chapter 1, verses 2 through 3 reads, "Just as it is written in Isaiah the prophet, 'Look, I send my messenger before your face, who will prepare your way. A voice crying in the desert, you, plural, prepare the way of the Lord. Straight, you, plural.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?